We're doing things a little different here. Started the video a little early for some reason, but let's take a look at Gearworld Borderlands. And my first impression of this in two-player was, hey, you know, almost no luck, pure strategy game. Interesting. Had some worries about how the multiplayer would end up playing out, especially since there's at least one thing in it that I feel is just so disturbing to my suspension of disbelief, and maybe a few other things. But it comes down to this is chaos. This is the most chaotic player interaction game that I've seen. Chaos is something that the Eon team loves to do, or loved to do. You saw it in different versions. So in Cosmic Encounter, it was the chaos of all these different abilities. But in the first Cosmic Encounter, there wasn't that much chaos. It had a stateliness to it, to tell you the truth. But when you start throwing all the expansions in, man, that game became chaos. In Dune, you had the chaos of the shifting alliances, of certain special abilities and cards that could come into play and really destabilize things. Similar to Cosmic Encounter, but nowhere near on the same level. I don't know if there's that much chaos in Quirks. It's predictable chaos if there is. Like, there's change in Quirks and radical change, but other than the cards that you draw, there's not. And we'll get to Quirks someday, I promise. Maybe we'll get to queer animals too. Although, I think American Megafauna does what I wanted to do with Quirks in a lot of ways. And we did get to that. I have not yet looked at Darkover. I've got it kicking around. I'm scared of it because theoretically it should not be solo playable. It's a very weird group game, and I've never played it, and I'm not sure how how it's going to work at all solo. Like, I'm going to have to make up rules to handle some of the mechanisms that are designed. Well, it may not be any worse than playing Civilization solo. But this one has the most fluid player interaction system in it. You can join in alliances when and where you like, but you don't get anything for it. All you get is the ability to help direct how the board's going to go. And I think that combination of not being able to be stopped from an alliance, and I don't know why anybody would want to, but also being able to just stick your foot in and trip somebody or whatever so much more freely than in Cosmic Encounter. In Cosmic Encounter, you always get something if you win as an ally, and you have something at risk if you lose. Anyway, let's take a look at the game. Let's talk first about components. Mixed bag here. Little plastic figures, hey, they work fine. They're just markers for what you own and what you don't. You could use anything. There are probably less of them, maybe, because they're made out of pieces of plastic instead of tokens, and there's no real reason for them to be tokens. Some of these things, they're very pretty. I like the colors, but they do kind of blur into each other, and maybe worst of all, which we'll glance at briefly, it's difficult to sometimes discern some of the borders in the map. The biggest gripe, though, the box is nice, is the rulebook. Now, I don't like the rulebook. I don't like modern rulebooks. It's filled with pictures. It's hard to understand. But the amount of griping that people did about it, I expected something terrible, and to me this is more or less on the modern, I mean, it's Fantasy Flight, and they don't tend to do really good rulebooks. And then beyond that, it's, it follows, as many of their books do, kind of the flavor of a modern Euro-type game. And I assume the other AT companies, if there are any out there, I guess there are, follow the same sort of flavor, which is, starting it off with these pictures. This is fine. This tells you what everything is. But this kind of trying to explain setup more through the map than anything else, and it really doesn't even help much. Maybe people are more used to the pictures helping them. I'm used to them being a pain in the ass, so, it didn't bother me that much here. I found the rules readable, understandable, and just a little too repetitive, which may be important simply because the concepts in this game are very different. I think you could boil these rules down to a much smaller size, as you could with most modern games. Rule bloat is a real problem, but I'm not sure you really... I'm not sure that these are at all bad rules compared to the kind of noise that people make about them. And I usually have a lot of trouble with rules, especially these modern ones. I'm not going to say they're good rules. Again, I don't like the system. Okay. I don't like the modern style of rules. So, what about the game itself? Setup, it's kind of like a Risk-type game or a Samurai Swords. You set up the board. It's kind of random because it presents the commodities in a semi-random position. Players have some choice as to where there will be commodities, but they don't know what's going to show up in any given space. And then they have this, oh yeah, I want this space, yeah, I want this space, just passing around the board. That's a neat mechanism. It randomizes and changes things nicely, and there's a lot of strategic import as to where you're going to be located. You want to get your production areas, but then you want to make sure you can defend them, so you got to get supporting areas all over the place, because support is key to the combat in this. Sequence of play has this really interesting mechanism in it that a lot of people seem to hate. And you can get rid of it, If you don't like it, get rid of it. It is part of the chaos, though. And that is that there are 5 phases in each round, and 3 of those phases, the ones in the middle, you don't know whether they're going to happen or not. They might happen 2/3 of the time they're going to happen. But the other third of the time, half the times they just don't happen. And the other half, the player who's the first player gets the choice as to whether or not they happen. You have an option. You can put a voting requirement in there as to whether or not they happen. But I like it with the chaos. I think that's really cool, and it shakes the game up. But you don't need it. You don't need it at all. The actual sequence. So the build phase is pretty simple. You got your stuff together, you can produce stuff. The production phase, again, you're sitting on the right location for things. You've set it up so that you don't have the pipeline clogged up with old goods, and you get stuff. The trade is weird, because the trade allows this teleport all over the place. Now, I think this is part of the chaos. The chaos is always generated by your interactions with other players in this game. It's not really a other than the, hey, I roll a die and we get this turn or not. It's not like you have this huge pile of cards that all kind of really random cool stuff could be built into, and you just don't know what's going to happen. You're not sitting there like, oh, I got the tricky card that's going to help everyone else. No. What you have is the ability to turn to somebody and say, hey, this helps us both a lot. We can just exchange things. We can get free moves out of this. That trading capability makes things really, really kind of crazy. What it also does is it means that if you're able to isolate a player, somebody who's in the lead, you can shut him out of that and pretty much knock them out of the game. That may, or at least out of the competition at that moment. That could be a big deal, because it may be that that particular mechanism, along with the alliances in combat, are just so much that 2 people can almost always stymie whoever's in the lead. Of course, that ends up with the kind of victory conditions that we see if people start getting that feeling, which is, hey, let's win together. Kind of like in Dune, actually, or Cosmic Encounter. Let's arrange things. Because we can keep stopping each other all the time, let's arrange things and cooperate and, hey, hey, it's a 4-player game. If 2 of us win, it's better than losing, right? You know, it's better than someone winning alone who's not you. So it's this interesting dynamic that I think most games will probably end in a buddy system. The game might go forever if you play with the all or nothing rules, which is that, you know, you can't share a victory and somebody wins, you know, alone. Okay. Then you have this ability to transport your stuff, and that's limited. Now, this is one of the couple of things that, something that's fairly expensive, which is the victory condition, the skyworm, gives you a couple of advantages. And one of the advantages it gives you has to do with production. The other one has to do with each one of those skyworks gives you an extra transportation ability. And those transportation abilities are really quite big, because unless you have a chain of horses all over the place, generally you've got a lot of stuff you want to move and not a lot of options to move it. And so each of those skyworks gives you an extra free transport if this phase happens. Then you get to the battle phase, and here you also have an interesting choice so many times where you're like sitting there, you must make one attack. Well, you get one free attack that you can't use for anything else. And then you get a second possible attack that you can instead take a transport. And you might say, well, attack sounds lots better than transport. Yeah, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's more important to move, to take another movement with your transports. So it gives you these interesting choices quite a few times. The problem with the battle phase, for me, or the potential problem, is that it's got this heavy counting element. It's completely deterministic once you know who's allying with whom. In the 2-player game, that means it's completely deterministic. You can look. The defender can sacrifice the territory if they want. There's generally no reason for doing that in 2-player. There might be in multiplayer as part of some kind of agreed upon deal. But in general, you can pretty much look at the board situation and say, yeah, I can take that. Nobody can stop me, or I'm pretty sure he's going to help me. His interests align with mine, or at least he's not going to hinder me. And you can count it up completely. But it means that all possible attacks become something that you might want to calculate. And that's the kind of thing that like starts whirring in my brain, and I start saying, oh boy, I'm in trouble here, right? That causes me huge problems in a game like Dominant Species, where I feel like I had to count things all the time. But I think Dominant Species also required that counting was going on to maintain board state. I'm not sure. I had something recent, too, where I was constantly counting. Maybe it was urbanization. I don't remember. There was something I was doing recently where I felt like I had to constantly be balancing things out and counting and just doing simple arithmetic and optimization over it. Now, optimization is not a trivial problem, but it's not a terribly interesting problem either to me. It's something that the computer's close to being able to do in general. General optimization, but anyway. You have these situations where you have lots of different places, and you might be able to identify this is where I want to go, and then you calculate it out and say, well, I can't get there. So now what's my second best place? Can I get there? Can I do this? Can I do that? And it starts getting more and more complex to figure out. And this is something I think is different between the two games, between this and the original edition. I think the original edition, this is just from what I read online, but nobody stated it completely that I ran into. I think the original edition only allowed you to send one spearhead in, which meant that the total number of possible combinations that you could generate on the board for an attack were less. So the complexity for figuring out your attacks was a little less. And of course, if you're playing with the original edition without the expansions, the islands aren't in there, and this, that, and the other. Strangely, though, as reliant as that seems on counting, it didn't bug me. I was largely okay with it, and largely okay with making mistakes. Probably because of the amount of chaos in the game. So, I'd look and I'd say, oh, fuck, man, how did I do that? Well, but that would be it. It would just be, oh, fuck, man, how did I do that? And then I'd go on. As opposed to this irritation that many other games that rely so heavily on counting, I'm just there, I'm counting, I'm like, ah, oh, shit. One of the nice things about this one is you can attack a place, and if you fail, it costs you nothing. Because the only thing you're penalized for is successful attacks. You're allowed 1 or 2 successful attacks in your battle phase. In terms of how well you can kind of wave your hands and figure out if this game fits any kind of reality, I think the decision to make these special sky cities, which, obviously are involved in this magical transportation, but also may be involved in certain other elements in the game. For example, why certain turns happen and why they don't. It may have something to do with that, or it may have something to do with wacky magical weather, or something like that. I think that actually kind of helped, as opposed to the original Borderlands, where it felt more like you were in kind of, not that I've played it, but, it's more of a kind of standard fantasy-type world, where there's not some kind of thing hovering over you, affecting and the transportation and stuff like that. So if that trading situation is in the original, and I assume it is, because I'm sure somebody would have called it out if that wasn't there. If that was new, because that's really wacky. Or if the turn order, the randomization of the turn order, was something that they added to this. I think somebody would have called that out, because so many people grump about it. But without knowing what the backstory in the original Borderlands is, it's hard to tell. Maybe there's some wizard who controls those things. Another thing I think the original Borderlands had was fixed cities. You had a number of cities about the board, and I don't think you were building them. I kind of like the building aspect, if that is a difference in this. Anyway, overall, I enjoyed this a whole lot more than I thought I was going to after I had played a 2-player. Because that 2-player game, it was fun. It was fun in the, I can dominate the board by making these moves. I go for this, and I take this over. We were done in, I think 2 rounds. I don't know what it was, 2 or 3 rounds. I had put my wife in a position where she just had no chance. She doesn't tend to think strategically in the same way I do, in terms of, I think she was thinking, I'll get to build my stuff and, build up my production and do what I want to do and play my little Euro over here. And no, you can't do that in this. I even found in the multiplayer game, I thought that there would be more stasis on the board than there was. There were times when a player couldn't do anything, or when a border was actually pretty inviolable by either side. But for the most part, there were opportunities to advance somewhere, and opportunities to shake up the current status quo somewhere. It's kind of oxymoronic, isn't it? Anyway. I'm not rating this real high. I think I give it about a 7, because I don't know. I honestly just don't know. There's something I really like about this game, but I feel like maybe somehow it just dragged me into its mood better than it should, and I'm going to need to play it some more times to really be sure that it's as good as it makes me feel right now. But it made me feel really good playing it solo in a way that and I can picture what it would be like to play it opposed with the kind of group that I used to have. And I think that would be really fun. I can imagine Jason, though. He'd hate this because, I don't know. So he'd have everything all planned out and prepared, and then somebody throws a wrench in the alliance system or whatever, or makes a trade that he just wasn't expecting, and everything collapses that he had intended. Because in the game we saw playing, that I was playing, we saw, a guy go from almost wiped out to boom, back almost in it, if things could have lasted a little longer. And I think there's a time limit on this sucker. I mean, the players control it, but I think eventually people are going to start building those skyworks unless they are being pathological about trying to keep the game going forever, and they're going to take it to the point where there are enough of them out there that somebody's going to win pretty soon. There's just, the production keeps coming eventually, and there's no way to really stop it from conglomerating and forming up into something, as long as people are trying to win. One thing to worry about with this is that it does have player elimination, or maybe even worse, close to player elimination. It looked to me like the green player was never going to be back in the game, but was kind of stuck there. On the other hand, what we saw was, hey, he kind of rebirthed at one point. That's actually, again, similar to Cosmic Encounter. I've seen people look like they're out of the game completely and win Cosmic Encounter. Of course, there are cards that allow you to just do that, as opposed to this, which doesn't have that kind of chaos in it. It's got to be driven by the players. It's not really by, just random things. Anyway, I did really enjoy this a lot more than I thought I was going to. Once I saw it, once I read the rules, etc. I thought it was going to be kind of lame, largely because there's these weird things in terms of linking it to some kind of reality, and it looked kind of simple, and I just figured it would collapse. It would reach these states where nothing would change or whatever. No, doesn't seem to happen at all. It seems the players will eventually get to a point where if they don't like what's going on, they'll say, screw this, and do something that will shake the game up. And that's the chaos. All right, let's end it up.